A little boy disappeared from his family one morning. 28 years later, his brothers knelt before the president of a nation, not knowing they were looking at the boy they had betrayed.
In a small village nestled between rolling hills and endless farmland, there lived a man named Obidas and his wife Ruth. They had been blessed with 4 sons who filled their modest home with laughter and the sound of running feet. The eldest was Henry, strong and dependable at 19. Emeka came next, clever with numbers and always quick with a joke. Then there was Stan, who had their father's gentle eyes and their mother's kind heart. And finally, there was James, the baby of the family at just 12 years old. For years, the 4 brothers were inseparable. They worked together in their father's small farm, played together under the mango tree in their compound, and shared dreams under the starlit sky. Henry would tell them stories of brave warriors, while Emeka would make them laugh with his imitations of the village elders. Stan would listen quietly, always ready with a comforting word, and little James would hang on every word, his eyes wide with wonder and admiration for his big brothers. But as the years passed, something began to shift in the household. It started small, an extra portion of meat on James' plate, a new shirt when his old one was barely worn, gentle words when he made mistakes that would have earned his brothers a stern lecture. James is still young, their mother Ruth would say, stroking his hair as he sat beside her in the evening. He needs more care. The boy has potential, their father Obidas would add, watching James with pride that seemed reserved only for him. I can see greatness in him. At first, the older brothers didn't mind. James was their little brother, after all. But as the favoritism became more obvious, as James received gifts they never got, praise they never heard, and forgiveness they were never shown, something dark began to grow in their hearts. The brothers began to meet in secret, away from their parents' watchful eyes. Under the old baobab tree at the edge of their property, their whispered conversations grew more bitter with each passing day. Did you see how father gave him that new bicycle? Henry's voice was tight with anger. We've been asking for one for years. And mother barely noticed when I brought home the best harvest from our section of the farm, Emeka added, his usual cheerfulness replaced by resentment. But when James helped plant just 1 row of beans, you'd think had discovered gold. Stan, usually the peacemaker, found himself nodding in agreement. It's not fair. We work twice as hard, but he's the one they love most. The poison of jealousy spread through their hearts like wildfire. What started as hurt feelings grew into something much darker. A plan born of desperation and envy. What if James wasn't here anymore? Henry said one evening, his voice barely above a whisper. What if we could make our parents see us again? The other brothers fell silent, but the seed was planted. Days passed before they found their opportunity. A group of traders was passing through their village, heading toward the distant city. They dealt in many things, including young servants for wealthy families in faraway lands. It would be temporary, Henry convinced himself and his brothers, just until father and mother learned to appreciate us. Then we'll bring him back. On a warm morning, when their parents had gone to the market, the 3 brothers approached James with false smiles. Come with us, little brother, Stan said, his voice betraying none of the turmoil in his heart. We want to show you something special by the river. James, trusting as always, followed eagerly. His face glowed with happiness. His beloved big brothers wanted to spend time with him. He chattered excitedly as they walked, pointing out birds and flowers, completely unaware of what awaited him. At the meeting point by the old bridge, the traders were waiting. They were rough-looking men with cold eyes and calloused hands. When they saw James, they nodded approvingly. He's young and strong, one of them said, examining James like he was livestock. He'll fetch a good price in the city. Only then did James realize what was happening. His face went white with shock and terror as the truth crashed over him. Brothers, what's happening? What are these men talking about? Henry couldn't meet his eyes. Emeka turned away. Even Stan, tears streaming down his face, couldn't look at their little brother. Please, James begged, his voice cracking with fear. Don't do this. I love you. I'm sorry if I did something wrong, but the deed was already done. Money changed hands, 30 pieces of silver, and rough hands grabbed James' arms. His cries for help echoed across the empty countryside as his brothers walked away, their hearts heavy, but their minds convinced they had done what was necessary. The last thing James saw of his childhood was his 3 brothers' retreating figures, growing smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely. When evening came and James didn't return home, Ruth began to worry. She paced their small kitchen, preparing his favorite meal while glancing anxiously toward the door. Where could he be? She murmured to herself. It was Henry who told her, his voice hollow and rehearsed. "Some traitors took him, Mother. They said they were looking for young boys. We tried to stop them, but there were too many." The lie fell from his lips like poison, but the damage was immediate and devastating. Ruth let out a scream that seemed to tear through the very fabric of their home. She collapsed to her knees, her hands clutching her chest as if trying to hold her breaking heart together. "My baby," she wailed. "My little James." The shock and grief were too much for her already fragile health. Her blood pressure spiked dangerously high, and within hours Ruth, the heart of their home, was gone, claimed by a broken heart and the weight of losing her beloved son. When Obidas returned to find his wife dead and his youngest son missing, the light went out of his eyes. He looked at his remaining 3 sons, searching their faces for answers that would make sense of this nightmare. "How could you let this happen?" he whispered, his voice broken with grief. But the brothers, trapped in their lie, could only hang their heads in false sorrow. They had gotten what they wanted, their parents' attention, but not in the way they had ever imagined. Within a month, Obidas followed his wife to the grave. The doctors said it was a heart attack, but the brothers knew the truth. He had died of grief, of losing the 2 people he loved most in the world. The once happy home became a tomb of silence and regret. Where laughter once rang out, now only the sound of wind through broken windows could be heard. The 3 brothers had traded their little brother for nothing but misery. Far from home, James found himself in a strange land where the language was different and the customs were foreign. The men who had bought him put him to work in the household of a wealthy merchant, where he scrubbed floors, tended gardens, and endured the harsh treatment of those who saw him as nothing more than property. The first years were the hardest. At night, lying on his thin mat in the servants' quarters, James would cry silently for his mother's gentle touch, his father's proud smile, and yes, even for the brothers who had betrayed him. The pain was so intense that it felt like a physical wound that would never heal. But James possessed something that his suffering couldn't destroy, an unbreakable spirit and a mind hungry for knowledge. He watched and learned from everyone around him. He studied the way the merchants conducted their business, memorized the patterns of trade, and slowly began to understand the language and culture of his new home. His intelligence and integrity didn't go unnoticed. The merchant's wife, a kind woman named Sarah, took pity on the young boy and began teaching him to read and write. "You have a gift, James," she would tell him. "Don't let circumstances define you. Let your character define your circumstances." Years passed. James grew from a frightened boy into a wise young man. His natural leadership abilities emerged, and he began helping his master make important business decisions. His honesty earned him trust, his intelligence earned him respect, and his kindness earned him love from those around him. When his master died, he left James a portion of his business. James used this opportunity to expand, treating his workers fairly and building partnerships based on trust rather than exploitation. His reputation spread throughout the land. By the time he was 30, James had become one of the most successful businessmen in the country. By 35, he was an advisor to the king. And by 40, through a combination of wisdom, integrity, and the support of the people who had come to respect him, James was elected president of the nation. Yet despite his success, the scars of betrayal remained. In quiet moments, when the weight of leadership pressed down on his shoulders, James would remember the faces of his brothers and wonder about the family he had lost. He carried their memory like a stone in his chest, heavy but somehow precious. Back in their village, life had become a series of disasters for Henry, Emeka, and Stan. Without their father's guidance and their mother's blessing, everything they touched seemed to wither and die. Henry's attempts at farming failed year after year. Crops that should have flourished under his experienced hand rotted in the fields. Emeka's business ventures collapsed one after another, taking with them what little money they had left. Stan, always the gentlest of them, found himself unable to form lasting relationships. The guilt of what they had done poisoning every connection he tried to make. Their family home fell into disrepair. The compound where 4 boys once played became overgrown with weeds. Neighbors began to whisper that the family was cursed, and many believed it was true. "We have to do something," Henry said one evening as they sat in their crumbling kitchen, sharing a meager meal. "We can't go on like this. I heard about a country far from here," Emeka suggested desperately. "They say the president there helps people in need. Maybe we could find assistance." It was their last hope. With nothing left to lose, the 3 brothers sold what little they had and began the long journey to the distant land they had heard about. They had no idea they were walking straight toward the very brother they had betrayed 28 years earlier. The presidential palace was magnificent, a testament to the prosperity and progress of the nation. James, now known as President James to his people, held regular audiences where citizens could bring their concerns directly to him. On this particular morning, 3 worn and weathered men were ushered into the great hall. Their clothes were patched, their faces lined with hardship, but something about them stirred a memory deep in James' heart. The brothers, not recognizing the powerful man seated on the throne as their little brother, fell to their knees as protocol demanded. "Your Excellency," Henry spoke for them, his voice humble and desperate. "We are strangers from a faraway village. We have lost everything. Our family, our livelihood, our hope. We come seeking your mercy and assistance." James leaned forward, studying their faces more carefully. The years had changed them, but not enough to hide their identities from the boy who had once looked up to them with such love and admiration. "Look at me," James commanded, his voice carrying the authority of his office but trembling slightly with emotion. The brothers raised their heads, and in that moment, recognition dawned like a thunderbolt. Henry gasped. Emika's face went white. Stan began to shake uncontrollably. "Do you know who I am?" James asked quietly. "James," Stan whispered, the name barely audible. "Our brother James." The great hall fell silent except for the sound of 3 grown men beginning to weep. They collapsed fully onto the floor, overwhelmed by shame, fear, and a grief that had been building for nearly 3 decades. "Forgive us," Henry sobbed. "We were jealous, we were young, we were foolish. We never meant for things to go so wrong. We've suffered for what we did," Emika added, his voice broken. "Every day has been a punishment. We destroyed our family. We destroyed ourselves." James stood from his throne and walked toward them, his own eyes filling with tears. He was no longer the president of a nation. He was once again the 12-year-old boy who had loved his brothers more than life itself. "Tell me about our parents," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Tell me about mother and father." The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Stan found the courage to speak the truth they had carried like a poison in their hearts for 28 years. "They're gone, James. Both of them. Mother. Mother died the very day you were taken. Her heart couldn't bear losing you. And father. He followed her within a month. The grief killed him." James staggered backwards as if he'd been struck. The news hit him with a force that no amount of success or power could shield him from. His parents, his beloved parents, had died believing their youngest son was lost forever. They had died without knowing he was safe, without knowing he forgave them their favoritism, without knowing how much he loved them. The president of the nation fell to his knees and wept like the lost child he had once been. For long moments, the great hall echoed with the sound of 4 brothers crying. For their parents, for their lost childhood, for the family that had been destroyed by jealousy and pride. Finally, James rose to his feet. His face was wet with tears, but his eyes held a depth of wisdom that only great suffering and great grace can bring. "I forgive you," he said simply. "Not because what you did wasn't terrible. Not because the consequences weren't devastating, but because carrying hatred has already cost me too much." His brothers looked up at him with wonder and desperate hope. But James continued, his voice growing stronger. "Forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. Your betrayal didn't just hurt me, it killed our parents. It destroyed the family I dreamed of returning to for 28 years. I can forgive you, but I cannot give you back what we all lost." He gestured to his guards. "Give them food, clean clothes, and a place to rest tonight. Tomorrow, provide them with enough resources to start again somewhere else. But after that, they must go." "James," Henry started to protest, hope and desperation warring in his voice. "No," James said firmly. "I am not the little brother who followed you blindly anymore. I am a man who has learned that love without boundaries is not love at all. I forgive you, but I cannot trust you. I wish you well, but I cannot welcome you back into my life." As his brothers were led away to be cared for, James stood alone in his grand hall. He had wealth, power, and the respect of an entire nation. He had forgiven his brothers and found peace with his past. But he was still, in many ways, the boy they had sold, forever changed by betrayal, forever shaped by loss. That night, James sat in his private chambers and looked out at the stars his mother had once pointed out to him. He whispered a prayer for her soul and his father's, telling them he had grown up to be a man they would be proud of. He had learned to forgive, but he had also learned to protect his heart. The story spread throughout the land, as such stories do. People spoke of the president, who forgave his brothers but held firm to his boundaries. Parents told their children about the dangers of favoritism and the poison of jealousy. Young people learned that success means nothing without love, and that love means nothing without wisdom. And somewhere in the distance, three brothers began a new journey, not toward wealth or power, but toward becoming the kind of men worthy of the forgiveness they had been given. They carried with them the hardest lesson of all, that some wounds heal, but scars remain forever, and some chances, once lost, can never be reclaimed. The boy they sold had become a man who understood both the power of forgiveness and the weight of consequences. And in that understanding, he found not happiness, but something deeper: wisdom, peace, and the strength to lead others toward both justice and mercy. In the end, James learned what his parents' favoritism could not teach him, what his brother's betrayal could not break in him, and what his success could not give him. That true greatness lies not in being loved above others, but in choosing to love despite being betrayed, while still having the wisdom to love yourself enough to set boundaries. The scars remained, but so did the healing. The family was lost, but the man who emerged from that loss became someone who could help heal other families, other hurts, and other betrayals. And that perhaps was the greatest victory of all.